right. Woo! Yeah, let's hear it. All right. Woo! Thank you guys for coming. I'm a little disappointed. They promised me pyrotechnics when I got out, but I will make do. Oh my gosh, this is so exciting. Thank you guys so much for having me. I am really excited to be here as the keynote speaker for South by Southwest EDU. All right. Only a couple more applause breaks, I promise. I know you guys are probably disappointed that the South by Southwest EDU keynote for today is not, in fact, Lin-Manuel Miranda. I apologize for that. I will do my best. It's really exciting to be here. This is actually my first South by Southwest. Anybody else here for the first time? Wow, a lot of you guys. Okay, welcome. As overwhelmed and freaked out as I am, I hope. Yeah, it's interesting because when I was telling people I was coming to South by Southwest, a lot of people were saying, oh, this is like really cool. There's going to be like celebrities and rock stars performing on stage. And I was like, you know, I'm kind of in awe right now because I think South by Southwest EDU got it backwards because I'm seeing the rock stars in the audience today. So, all right, so let's get into it for today. I'm going to be talking to you guys about science comedy. Part 1, why it's a thing. I'm going to get a little bit into the comedy of science and the science of comedy. Then I'll go into part 2, how to do it. So you guys are going to be leaving here today with 18 tried and true tools for being funny when communicating in STEM. So there's something that will actually be practical about this talk. And then finally, we will have time for questions at the end. So as I go through this presentation, if you have any questions, please make sure to write them down through the Slido app. It should be in the sessions section of the South by Southwest app. I'll let you guys figure it out, and I will answer them at the end. So yes, if you guys have questions or compliments, please put them there. If you have criticisms, there's this app in your phone called Notes. Trust me, it goes someplace really important. Just put them there. All right. So I have an hour with you today. And so I want to try a little experiment. So what if instead of giving you this riveting, rollicking talk, I asked you all just to sit in silence for an hour? How about we sit in silence for an hour? How would you feel about that? Probably the worst possibility imaginable for many of you, like myself, because it would be incredibly boring. What would you do to avoid that situation? Well, scientists actually have a pretty good idea of what you would do to avoid that situation. For starters, according to science, people would rather electrocute themselves than be bored. Yeah, so a 2014 study out of the University of Virginia put hundreds of undergraduates in a room and asked them just to be alone with their thoughts. And surprisingly, a lot of people reported they were bored. Science. But then they were given, in phase 2, the option to electrocute themselves. And even though these undergrads, these poor undergrads, had responded earlier that they would have preferred to pay money than be electrocuted, when the alternative was being alone with their thoughts, people preferred electrocution. And by people, I am also, of course, referring to mostly men. The breakdown was about 2/3 male, 1/4 women for electrocution. But still. In researching this talk, I was a little bit nervous. I was like, oh my gosh, what if I'm boring on stage today? So I actually came prepared. If any of you guys are bored, there's actually some exposed wiring along the side of the stage. Have at it. So one of the cool things about this study is there's actually kind of a silver lining. In order to not be boring, you just have to be more entertaining than electrocuting yourself. But I'm going to try to bring this a step further. So this is me. I am a science comedy writer. Who here knows the guy I'm with right now? Yeah. So he's kind of the opposite of boring. This is my former boss and mentor, Neil deGrasse Tyson. And I met him in 2016. And he had a pretty dramatic impact on my life. I started lead writing for his show, Star Talk. Excuse me, not quite. Going back. Oh, I'm missing a slide. OK, so I started writing for his show, Star Talk. And when I was writing for Star Talk, I got to do what all comedy writers dream of. I got to write for amazing comedians like Sashir Zamata and Chuck Nice. And even cooler, and kind of more unexpectedly, I got to meet really cool scientists, such as Neil deGrasse Tyson, but also astronauts like Mark Kelly. And even got to work with robots like Sophia the robot. So it was a real dream. But most importantly, I got a front row education in STEM, which I had been sorely missing. Now, prior to working at Star Talk, I was really interested in political comedy. I was interested in political comedy because I grew up with Jon Stewart and the rise of political satirists using humor as a tool to educate the public about politics. I actually, through this interest, I got to write for the White House Press Correspondence Dinner, which was like a total dream. And I actually wrote my thesis on political comedy in undergrad at Harvard. This was the process of writing said thesis. Yeah, how many people here know what that feeling feels like when writing a thesis? Yeah, existential despair. But one of the interesting things, actually, about majoring in government at Harvard is that it had the fewest number of requirements. It was actually generally considered the easiest concentration of everything out there. What that says about our modern day political system, I'll let you guys be the judge. But one of the benefits of having so few requirements is that I actually got to take a lot of electives. And specifically, I took science electives. So I took science electives because I was really passionate about science in high school. This was me in high school. Now, I wonder what you're thinking. Why is this amateur magician at a bat mitzvah presenting at a science fair? I was really into vests, you guys. Still am. You guys are clocking it. All right. So yeah, very into science. I was really into science. I did the California State Science Fair many years out of high school. But I ultimately didn't pursue it in college. Why didn't I pursue STEM as a major? Well, all I can tell you for now is that I'm not alone. So according to a 2016 study that has later been verified more recently, there is a drop-off in interest in STEM that starts roughly around the 4th grade. So around 4th grade, about 2/3 of girls and boys, roughly the same numbers, are interested in the STEM. But then, as you go into high school, you see those numbers start to change. Specifically, you see a drop in girls, about 57% of girls are interested in STEM, and a rise in boys, about 70%. And then we experience what I call the college cliff. When people actually go to college, you see these numbers drop dramatically. 17% of girls and about 32% of boys actually choose to major in STEM. And even worse, only half of those people complete their degree. Until finally, we only have about 19% of women and 30% of men entering the STEM workforce. So what do I attribute to this lack of interest in STEM over time? Well, I attribute it to boredom. Boredom is a problem because boredom has consequences. Like missed opportunities for this poor, unfortunate boy. But then there's the consequences of boredom in science. And boredom in science has high consequences because science has high consequences. Missed opportunities in the real world are one thing, but missed opportunities in STEM translate to unheard theories, uninvented technologies, uninspired scientists, and worst of all, untapped potential scientists. So that was a little bit about boredom in science. Now to get into why. So one reason I blame for boredom in science is jargon. Now, jargon is any particular words or phrases used by a group that are oftentimes hard to discern by outsiders. Now, we use jargon a lot of the times to signal who we are, not by what we say, but by how we say it. But the trade-off there is that we're excluding people. So unfortunately, well, before I get into the consequence of that, it reminds me of this great quote by Gilbert and Sullivan. "If this young man expresses himself in terms too deep for me, why, what a very singularly deep young man this deep young man must be." I think that's kind of like what people, how they want to be seen when they're using complex scientific jargon. So here are some of the consequences of it. The more jargon you put in your abstract, researchers found the fewer citations those papers were actually cited for. So unfortunately, this problem is actually on the rise. We're seeing more and more jargon in abstracts. This was a study of about 650 abstracts, but in a much larger comprehensive study of about 700,000 papers, we're seeing readability decline dramatically. And researchers attribute this to the rise in jargon, why there is such lower readability. So there are many consequences to boredom. How many of you guys have performed in front of audiences that look like that? I know what it feels like right now. Just kidding. Thank God, no. So boredom has a lot of consequences. One thing is it's correlated with poor sleep. Another thing is that it is correlated with cardiovascular issues and also mortality. And then, as you can see from this picture, if you look closely enough, boredom is actually associated with messy sausage fingers. So a lot of these images were created with the help of AI. And I just want to point out that AI still can't do fingers, so still hilarious. All right, so there are consequences to boredom. But one of the things I want to ask you guys is, how do we combat boredom? Well, it'll probably surprise nobody, being given my introduction and everything, that I am going to argue that humor combats boredom. So here are some reasons why I think humor can combat boredom. Well, one, just on the physical level, it can actually counteract some of those health issues we just talked about. So comedy can help reduce anxiety and blood pressure, perhaps mitigating the effects in the boredom situation with cardiovascular health. And then it has a lot of effects on reducing stress. So it's really good for your health. But conceptually, one of the reasons why I think humor combats boredom has to do with this old saying. There's an old adage that says, the opposite of love isn't hate, it's indifference. Well, there's a corollary here, I find, which is that the opposite of boredom isn't just tragedy in the form of electrocution. It's also comedy. Now, comedy and tragedy actually kind of have something in common. They're both stories with surprises at the end. Structurally, they're actually quite similar. Now, before I get into the science of comedy a little bit, I just want to say that there's a quote about talking about comedy from E.B. White. "Explaining a joke is like dissecting a frog. You understand it better, but the frog dies in the process." So my apologies, y'all. There's going to be a lot of dead frogs on stage tonight. I'm used to performing in clubs, excuse me. If you could all just pretend that you're drunk, that would really make me feel at ease. Anyway, so yeah, I'm going to be talking a little bit about comedy, and sometimes that takes the joy out of it. But I do find that laughter is the sound of the unexpected. And in a way, when you think about it, the setup is there to set expectations, and the punchline upends them. That's the basic anatomy of a joke. So what I want to know was, this next part is about how in some ways humor is actually like a science experiment. But it's like a science experiment where the hypothesis is delightfully wrong. So it has some similarities to the scientific method. So like I said earlier, humor and tragedy kind of are mirrors of each other because they both have a similar arc structure with a surprise at the end, and they're both kind of like stories. And there's a wealth of research that you guys as educators probably know about how stories can improve memory. This was an early study out of Stanford that's later been reaffirmed and replicated, that stories can improve memory 7-fold. When undergraduates were asked, these poor undergraduates, when undergraduates were asked to memorize a bunch of information, when they could put into a story, it improved the amount of information they could remember by 7 times. And so stories are good for memory, and what is comedy if not a story with something unexpected at the end? I love this GIF. Let's just watch it one more time. Okay. Now, there's a wealth of research about how comedy is useful for communication. So we find that comedy can make others think of you as more confident and competent. Audiences retain information longer when they enjoy receiving it. And laughter increases energy, interest, and approval of a topic. It's probably why I, to you guys, appear so confident and competent, and you're all so approving of me right now. Just kidding. Put it in the Slido app, guys, if you disagree. All right. So I was looking at a lot of this humor research a couple of years ago, and there's a wealth of it. There's a lot of humor research out there. But what's interesting is it's all studying comedy's effect on different types of engagement. But it's not studying different types of comedy. Now, as a comedy writer, this is something I think about a lot. And the scientists leading these studies probably don't think about different types of comedy. But as a quick little experiment, I want you guys to think of comedy. Just think to yourself whatever jumps to mind. Now, I don't know what you're thinking, but I know that you're not all thinking the same things. Some of you might be thinking about Ricky Gervais's stand-up. Some of you might be thinking about the Muppets. I don't know if anybody here is thinking about Abbott Elementary. Yeah, knowing the educators in the audience might like that one. So there's different types of comedy, and there's different ways to think about them. There's different formats, of course. There's TV shows versus stand-up. There's different styles. There's cerebral versus slapstick. But there's one axis that matters the most to me in the line of work that I do, and that is positivity versus aggression. So positivity versus aggression matters a lot to me as a science comedian. Here's why. So in a nutshell, aggressive humor is known as Juvenalian satire. It is aggressive, it's biting, and most importantly, it's targeted. There's an object of derision. Then there's Horatian satire. Horatian satire is more playful, it's bridge building. Sometimes the object being made fun of is the person themselves. Hence why this Muppet looks so strange. Sometimes the comedy comes from the oddness of the thing emanating the comedy. Now, with Juvenalian satire, it's aggressive, but you guys are probably familiar with it. It is buffeted by the superiority theory of humor. The superiority theory of humor was first put forward by everybody's favorite comedian, Thomas Hobbes. Yeah, the guy who wrote Leviathan thought he'd weigh into comedy. And his theory was that people found stuff funny, people laughed at the misfortune of others because it reinforced their own superiority. Kind of a depressing theory, what a shocker, from Thomas Hobbes. So that is the superiority theory of humor, but you're probably already familiar with it with things like, for example, the Darwin Awards. The Darwin Awards are a great example of feeling superior at the misfortune of others. It sort of reminds me of that Mel Brooks quote about this kind of humor. He says, tragedy is when I get a paper cut. Comedy is when you fall into an open sewer grate and die. So, different levels of empathy there. Positive humor, however, is buffeted slightly more by the benign violation theory of humor. So the benign violation theory holds that humor comes from something that violates a social norm, something unexpected, but most crucially, does not cause harm. Now, this, for example, a good example of the benign violation, more positive theory of humor might be Borat's bikini. He is certainly violating a social norm, and arguably it's benign. Arguably. So there are different types of comedy, and so this led me to asking this question. Does humor increase trust in science communication, and if so, crucially, what kind? What do different types of humor, how do they actually affect science communication? So there, like I said, there was this wealth of information on different types of engagement, and not different types of comedy. And so I decided to fix that. I and my team teamed up with the wonderful researchers at the University of Utah under the lab of great humor researcher Sarah Rose, and we designed a study that we just finished. The results are actually just analyzed. So this study is hot off the press, still has that new study smell, which also means it's not peer reviewed. So take it for what you will. But I'm very excited about these results. So let me tell you how the study was designed. 3 groups of people heard a speech from a scientist about an obscure renewable energy. The first group heard an unfunny version of the speech. The second group heard an aggressive and darkly funny version of the speech. You could tell that he's aggressive because he's wearing a leather jacket now. And then the final group heard a positive and playfully funny version of the speech. You can tell it's playful because he's shrugging. What's the deal? Woo. That's how I imagine him speaking. Anyway, okay, so 3 different types of speeches. And here were the results. They found that the more mirth the scientist produces, which is our measurement for humor, the more trustworthy the scientist appears. That's great. But there was an important caveat. The more aggressive the scientist is perceived, trust plummets. So this is really important information because when I talk about comedy and science communication, people tend to think about all different types of comedy, but you really have to think about more positive versions of comedy. So the takeaway from this study is if you're going to use comedy in your chosen field, and I do recommend it, the most important thing is to be positive. Look at that guy giving the thumbs up. Very positive. So think a little bit more like Pee Wee Herman and a little bit less like Triumph the Insult Comic Dog. Be positive. Now I'll give you a real-world example of the perils of aggressive comedy and science communication. Who here knows who this guy is? Anybody? Shout it out. Yeah! Giving the educators a little taste of your own medicine there with the cold call. It is Galileo. Good job. Extra credit. So yes, that is Galileo. So people say commonly that Galileo was arrested for saying the sun was the center of the solar system, but that's not exactly the whole story. So in 1616, Galileo did have a lot of run-ins with the Catholic Church, but by 1632, the Pope had actually given Galileo permission to publish about heliocentrism. So there was one condition to this approval. Galileo had to give the Pope's counter-argument fair treatment. So Galileo published a dialogue. And in the dialogue, he would have an author's stand-in. The author's stand-in was a noble philosopher named Salviati. And for the Pope's view, his stand-in was a comically incompetent philosopher named, and I kid you not, Simplicio. Yeah. So, not too surprisingly, the church was not very happy with that. So they placed him under lifelong house arrest, and they banned him from ever publishing again. Now, the book was still a commercial success, in my opinion, testifying to the ability of comedy's effect on communication to improve communication. However, Galileo failed to consider all of his audience. Now, what was Galileo's main problem? Was it perhaps the lack of good public education? Was it perhaps the lack of separation between church and state? Well, I argue it's neither of these. I argue that he should have hired professionals, specifically my company. We were about 400 years away from existing, but still. So inspired by my time writing for Neil deGrasse Tyson, I started a company called Hello SciComm. And at Hello SciComm, we help all kinds of STEM professionals to communicate in an entertaining way. We make intelligence entertaining. So here are some reasons why. Oh, by the way, yeah, this is what a typical meeting looks like. I just write jokes on the board, and then we just write them all down. All right, so here's why we do what we do, in a nutshell. Science is the frontier of knowledge. Technology is the frontier of tools. But frontiers are scary. By their very nature, the frontiers are the edge of the unknown. So frontiers are scary. And as my former boss, Neil, used to say, you can't laugh and be afraid at the same time. And as I like to say, comedy is a backdoor into consciousness. So that's a little bit about why we exist and our mission statement. Let me tell you a little bit about what we believe in. We believe in fun, most importantly, as you can tell from this photo. We also believe in shaking hands. And finally, we believe in casual water cooler talk. Just some candid shots of us around the office. Very candid and not staged. So let me tell you a little bit about our work in the world, making all kinds of STEM entertaining. So we have helped put science and comedy into the world in a number of ways. We've helped create a chatbot that was sold at Sotheby's. We've created viral TikToks for a prominent science magazine. We helped create the personality for a robot at Honda. This is a different robot. We work with a lot of robots. For some reason, a quarter of our clients are robots. Anyway, just worked out that way. And then finally, most recently, we wrote jokes for a kidney donation advocate before Congress. Helped her leave an impression. And our work has taken us all over the world, everywhere from Yale to the UN to Universal Studios, spreading humor and STEM communication wherever we go. But here's the thing. What we do isn't, you're not born with it. It's inherent. It's actually teachable. So I'm going to walk you through our formula. So I present to you guys the principles of SciComm. Imagine reverb on that. Science comedy. The principles of science comedy. So the first principle of science comedy is positivity. Borrowing a little here from Marie Kondo, but think about what sparks joy in your chosen field, and then channel that positivity. If you're in math, we all know that there was that one moment where you first fell in love with math, or maybe it grew on you, but channel that positivity of what sparked joy in you in the first place, that beginner's enthusiasm. In ornithology, there's this really great term called spark bird. Spark bird is your bird that first got you interested in ornithology. And I know this because I was into ornithology in high school. Very, very cool. And my spark bird was the northern gannet. And I got so good at doing the bird call for the northern gannet that I actually got to do the bird call on the Letterman show in high school. I was super, super cool. So if I did the bird call right now, northern gannets would flood the room. No, I'm out of that game now. I'm out of the game. All right. I lost. You know what? You know what? Afterwards, maybe in the questions time. All right. I got to get through the presentation. So in a way, my spark bird was not just the northern gannet. It was also the Letterman show itself. The Letterman show kind of functioned as my spark bird because I got interested in comedy. So that was why we were ecstatic to get the results that we did from the University of Utah, because it showed what essentially 10 years of empirical data of my work as a science comedy writer and the past 4 years for my company had what the data that we'd been exposed to, which is that positivity matters because enthusiasm is contagious. And this I had learned from Neil. So I thank him for that. Now, we put this work into the world. So for example, one way that we put positivity into our humor and into conversations about STEM, we were asked by this wonderful science magazine, Proto.Life, to write a piece about the science of longevity. Here is how we chose to approach the science of longevity. Old people are hot now. Who's ever clapping? I like that. You know what I mean. All right. We chose to, take on this topic in the more delightful tone that channels the positivity that a lot of experts in longevity are trying to go for. So in a way, this principle trumps all the other ones I'm going to tell you guys today. Today, we're in the morning, I'm sorry. All right, here we go. Next up, timing, the principle of comedy to timing. What I mean by that is one of the first principles of comedy is timing. Timing isn't just about delivery, though, it's also knowing when to tell a joke. So I personally don't think that there's any place where you can't tell a joke. Here are situations that could use humor. Some of these are ones I've actually employed. But the most important thing is to read the room. Doesn't matter where you are, it matters the people you're with. So that's a little bit about timing. Next up, keep it simple. So keep it simple, or in other words, it is paramount to keep one's discourse straightforward, that is to say elementary, transparent. You get the idea. Keep it simple. Keep it simple, why? Because this is what most people think they look like, when in reality, that's what they actually look like. We tend to have a simpler version in our heads than what manifests. So keep it simple and keep it contained. Yeah, I know. Oh, I'm so glad you like that, because you're going to love the rest of this presentation. Lot of cat gifs. Anyway, next principle, be relatable. So if you're going to communicate about something relatively unknown to an audience, try to use known examples, comparison, references, all different types of relatable references. So for example, if you're talking about the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, where you can't know an electron's true velocity or position in time and space, maybe relate that to how you can never tell where the dang TV remote is, am I right? Relatable! Here's an example of the way we used relatable comedy in the world. So for that very kidney transplant activist I was talking about earlier, she was at a congressional hearing. We wrote this joke for her. I also want to mention that kidney donation is safer than childbirth, and you don't have to pay for them to go to college. That one hit really hard with Congress for some reason, so maybe there's hope. So be relatable. Know your audience. Make pop culture references, but make sure they're relatable. So for example, I might be a huge fan of the Ukrainian show Newchash, which is about a detective who uses his sense of smell to smell out crime. But you guys probably don't know that show. And so if I were to make a reference, like a knowing inside joke about the sexual tension between the sniffer and Yulia in seasons 1 and 2 of Newchash, you guys probably wouldn't get that reference. But if I were to make a joke about, I don't know, the sexual tension between Janine and Gregory in Abbott Elementary, yeah, I know. Fingers crossed, guys. That would probably reach more people in an education-based audience. Yes, so weird I would choose the show Abbott Elementary, a show about how educators can transform lives. That right there is known as pandering. Anyway, so make pop culture references that people will understand. That is the point of that. For example, in this audience, maybe some jokes about how driving in downtown during South by Southwest sucks and what it's like to be a teacher. Here is an example of knowing your audience in our work in the world. We were representing a science magazine. They wanted to reach a younger audience. So one, we went to a platform that was an example of knowing our audience. We decided to start their TikTok. Then we decided to to summarize a lot of their articles in digestible forms that people like Gen Z kids would like. So for example, we did a TikTok explaining how seahorses reproduce by showing somebody breaking up with a marine biologist because human males are worse partners than seahorse partners. Anyway, I recommend you check it out. All right, so next up, the information burger. You guys probably know this one. The information burger is a 3-step process of telling your audience information. 3 steps to the process. Tell them what you're going to tell them. Tell them what you told them. That technique was the information burger, a 3-step process for helping your audience retain information. Yeah. Some of you saw what I did there. I appreciate that. Hope you like meta jokes. All right. Speaking of hamburgers to represent information, metaphors. Metaphors are your friend. Metaphors are a bridge to understanding. Metaphors are like a friend that teaches you something helpful. That was a simile. Boom. That was an onomatopoeia. Anyway, metaphors, very useful. Here are some examples of metaphors. If you're going to talk about the heart, you could talk about it as a pump. If you're going to talk about the digestive system, it's like plumbing. Here's some metaphors we've used in our work. So for that renewable energy client, we wrote this joke. Comparing EGS energy to oil and gas is like comparing Dennis Quaid to Randy Quaid. Sure, they're related, but one should probably stay in Canada. Metaphors. So that right there, that's a simile. And by the way, to clarify, similes are a subtype of metaphor. So a simile is like a mint chip cookie if metaphors are baked goods. That was a metaphor explaining metaphors. OK, moving on. So next up for this same EGS client, this is actually a metaphor. EGS, unlike solar energy, can run 24/7. It is the Waffle House of renewable energy. So make sure, however, not to mix your metaphors. Be careful. You know, I know that it's hard. You can mangle your metaphors. But of course, you can't always make an omelet by beating a few dead horses. So careful with the metaphors. Another thing to be wary about with metaphors is that they can sometimes lead your audience too far down a rabbit hole. So for example, we've learned a lot about atoms as like mini planetary systems with planets being electrons orbiting the center. However, as you get further in physics, you realize that this metaphor actually is not super accurate, that in fact electrons are more like a cloud of probability. So make sure that you are careful with your metaphors. Here's a bad metaphor example. Sarah's job is like a therapist in that she gets paid to do what most people do for free. This metaphor comes from my mom. Why is this a bad metaphor? Well, it's actually a simile. It's wordy, and also it's hurtful. So, all right, let's skate on through. Use visuals. They can leave your audience, they can help with memory. So using visuals can help your audience remember things like sinking into your audience like a kitten on a memory foam mattress. I am going to skate past some of these examples because I want to get to questions at the end. So I'm going to move on through. You know, OK, let me explain this one, actually. So one of our clients was a bear safety expert. And she was trying to tell her students never to spray bear spray when the bear was less than 4 meters away. And so we helped her explain that to her audience by saying, what if instead of 1 Canadian metric, you used an even better one and said, spray the bear when it's 2 Trudeaus away? Or 1 Trudeau, or 2/3 of a Trido. Anyway. Next up, have confidence. So don't get locked into the Dunning-Kruger effect. These are the researchers. Here's the Dunning-Kruger effect. What you find is as somebody enters a field, even though their competence is low, their enthusiasm is high, and then we enter this low period. I call this low period grad school. Grad school is when you know a lot about what you don't know. And then you go back up, and then you actually become an expert. Next up, rule of threes. People remember things in threes well. Remember the information hamburger, for example. Well, in comedy, it's also useful because it takes two things to establish a pattern, and then the third thing can upend them. So the rule of threes is very helpful, it's engaging, and it will get you laid. So use the rule of threes. Here's an example that we use for renewable energy. There are 3 groups of people against geothermal energy: environmentalists, competitors, and people recently dumped by geologists. So another example. Keep them guessing. So this is a really fun principle I made up. I like to play with the audience a little bit. So here's a quote about it. Drop in an occasional lie to engage your audience. You can't believe everything you see in a PowerPoint. This, of course, comes from Susan B. Anthony. Very ahead of her time on that one. Women's suffrage and PowerPoints, saw it coming. So like, for example, earlier you might have noticed the strange look of Dunning and Kruger. That's not, in fact, Dunning and Kruger. That is, in fact, Siegfried and Roy, famed lion-taming duo from Vegas. OK, next principle up, be self-deprecating. So make sure not to overdo this one. You don't want to fall into the Dunning-Kruger effect. But it is good to be self-deprecating. So for example, earlier I mentioned my mom. That is a great way of being self-deprecating, is talking about how your mom keeps sending you LSAT books in the mail. Great way of being self-deprecating. Fun examples. So I'm going to skate past some of these and just say explaining generative AI, maybe have it generate something interesting. Or take an example like this and work backwards. Like, how did we end up at this point where AI still can't do fingers? Still can't do fingers. Still hilarious. All right, relatedly is absurd application. So maybe explain a process through a funny context. So for example, this guy is using geothermal heat to bake a pizza. Here's another example. This was a famous epidemiology paper, and they used it to explain the mechanics of the zombie apocalypse. Or for example, with my company, we used AI tools to create the world's most perfect Super Bowl commercial. I strongly recommend you guys look it up on YouTube. But the best example of absurd application is Randall Munroe's book, What If? Yes, absolutely. He answers with very serious science, very silly questions, such as, what would happen if the universe were filled with soup? Or what would happen if you threw a baseball at the speed of light? So he has some really great examples of that. I strongly recommend checking it out as an example of science comedy. Next up, Chekhov's gun. So Chekhov's gun is a dramatic principle by which you only introduce details, particularly high-stakes details, if they're going to pay off later. So we took this principle and we decided to make it fun, Chekhov's fun. So he had talked about introducing a gun on stage. It's got to go off later. But we wanted to think, what if you could actually bribe your audience in a positive way? So if you can stick through the next principle I'm about to go through with you, I will share with you a GIF of a kitten discovering it has feet. OK? That's what's hanging in the balance. That's the bribe here. All right, next up, everyone's favorite, wordplay. So a lot of puns are just predictable homonyms that you can see coming. As teachers, you're probably familiar with these two. When you ever have to introduce these topics to a class, you could see the jokes coming on the horizon. But some puns are good because they're truly unexpected. I don't know if we have any Arrested Development fans. Yeah, OK, Arrested, there you go. But Mitch Hurwitz is a pun genius. An example of a pun we used in our work, once again for renewable energy, we wrote this joke. EGS is great for the planet because it produces fewer greenhouse gases than your average Taco Tuesday. I like this one because you don't see it coming. So puns, very useful. Now that's it for wordplay. Now earlier, remember when I said if you could stick through the next principle, I would show you a GIF. Remember my Chekhovian promise to you, the Chekhov's fun principle? Well, here is said GIF of kitten discovering it has feet. And boom. I have fulfilled my promise. Next one, related to Chekhov's gun, callbacks and running gags. So this one is kind of related to bribing your audience because callbacks and running gags give your audience a sense of cohesiveness to the whole presentation. And they reward your audience for paying attention. So for example, callbacks can help you to shock your audience. Remember from earlier? Remember that? Yes. That is a callback. A callback is also what my mom wants from me. So that was my third or fourth mom reference, so that makes it a running gag. Running gag happens more frequently throughout a presentation, and it also gives a sense of cohesiveness to the presentation. So for example, my mom, oh, by the way, I don't know if you guys noticed, but wearing a vest. Really into vests in high school. One might say they were a good investment. Anyway, still rocking it. So my mom was a running gag, and also kittens were a running gag throughout this presentation, giving a sense of cohesiveness. Let's watch it one more time, because it almost makes it, and then boom. Okay. All right. So summaries are kind of in a way like callbacks because they also give your presentation a sense of cohesiveness. So as we're getting close to the end, I'm going to do a little bit of a summary here. So summary of the presentation. Electrocution is apparently preferable to boredom. Boredom is an epidemic in STEM. Humor combats boredom and helps communication, but only if it's positive, okay? That's really important and key. STEM represents frontiers in science and tech, and humor can combat those fears that those frontiers produce. Then here are some of the principles I went over. I won't bore you with them, but I will say the last one I saved for the end. Surprisingly, I saved the last one for the end. Who would have thought? The final principle to get to before questions, interactivity. This is a way of breaking the fourth wall and including your audience. So, for example, if everybody wouldn't mind checking under your seats right now, yeah, you will find nothing, because the prize was the journey, folks. But interactivity can help. And so I will say the one way of interacting at the end is definitely by reaching out to me. I would love to hear from you guys. There's so many awesome people here. I would love to hear what you're doing and how comedy might be able to help you. So there's that. And then there's also questions. So I would love to answer any questions you guys might have. I hope some of you have been writing them down throughout the Slido app. And here we are. Oh my God, the bird call. So listen, you guys. This is like asking Paul McCartney to do a Beatles song. I need my team. You saw there were 2 people on stage with me. Also, the mic guys, they wouldn't like it because I got to get real loud, and I think it would blow out the speakers. So, nah. You know what? If South by Southwest invites me back next year, then I'll do it, okay? All right. I know, the groans. Oftentimes, it's been a long time. Maybe at the end, maybe. I'll keep delaying it. This is my Chekhovian promise. All right. Respect your boundaries, did you say? Thank you. Love it. All right, next step. Okay, from Tim Barnes. Oftentimes, humor is difficult for students with disabilities or language barriers to understand. What recommendations do you have to overcome those challenges? That's a great question. So I had a really wonderful improv teacher that I was consulting, and I was I was actually writing jokes for a eulogy, and it was kind of difficult, as you would imagine. And I was asking him about it, and he said, my approach to comedy in difficult situations is that the medicine goes where it hurts. And I really liked that. So I really feel like there is like no boundaries to where you can do comedy. It is just a matter of reading the room and being empathetic with your audience. I also, by the way, while working at StarTalk, got to work with a wonderful comedian who has cerebral palsy. And there's actually like a lot of really amazing comedians with disabilities who perform. So I strongly recommend, Tim, that you look to those people because oftentimes they can speak firsthand about that lived experience. And they're devastatingly funny. I saw this one disabled, yeah, I'm not gonna do the joke because he's disabled and it'd be funnier if you heard him doing it. But I recommend looking into those wonderful comedians on YouTube. All right, I promised my children I would bring back a science joke from your talk. Any good ones to bring back to the little ones? I mean, that was the whole 45 minutes beforehand. You know, there's like, oh my God, again with all the rest of the questions are bird call requests. I haven't done it in 10 years, you guys. I appreciate the woman who was like, please respect her boundaries. Okay, all right, you know what? It's gonna be so bad. It's gonna be so bad. I think it went something like this. It was a little bit like that. Thank you. I chose it because it was weird sounding. That's why Letterman liked it. All right. Okay. Any guidance on knowing how much comedy is too much? So this is like a broader type of question, and the answer is always going to come down to reading the room. So it is hard when you're giving a joke in a context where you actually can't see the audience. But if you're performing in front of a crowd, how much comedy is too much really just depends. It's a feedback situation. Like, you know, if you tell a joke in a forest and nobody hears it, doesn't make a sound, comedy is like it's a subjective experience. So you really have to remember the other part of the equation. So how much comedy is too much? It really has to do with how your audience is perceiving the humor. Let's see. What does the research show related to gender differences and perceptions when using humor? So that is something I'm less expert in because I find most of those studies depressing. But what does the research show related to gender differences and perceptions? I've read a little bit of the research, but don't feel like qualified enough to speak to it. I will say experientially about what I have seen is that men tend to be more comfortable with like a non-safe world. Like for example, It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia or Ricky Gervais, whereas females tend to prefer a more safer world, like the movie Bridesmaids. Usually fewer people die in comedies marketed to women. This one says, as an amateur magician myself, I just want to point out that we don't all wear vests. Hurtful stereotype, I guess. Well, I would just say this to whoever asked that question, or to David. David Trachtenberg. You say, as an amateur magician, I don't want to point out that we all wear vests. Well, I say, David, that's why you're an amateur. All right. All right. What advice would you give edutainers who want to incorporate comedy into history education during our times of tense politicization of social issues? Well, there's also a common saying in comedy, which is, don't punch down. Comedy is a really good way to reach audiences, and history is a story. And sometimes there's actually comedy in history, and you don't have to do too much to work it, like that Galileo example. So sometimes just seeking out the comedy is useful. In general, I think when teaching history, there should be you should try to search for those kind of pockets of joy so it's not just all war and famine and stuff, even though that's important. So in general, to this question, I would just say, just make sure that you're never punching down. And that's kind of a good rule of thumb that will never lead you astray. Oh boy, all right, this one. Jason Paul outed me. Here we go. As a psychedelic stand-up comedian, that's my side job, how do you see the role of humor in destigmatizing conversations about mental health and consciousness exploration? So, thank you for outing me, Jason Paul. I work on the side. I do a lot of stand-up comedy at psychedelic pharmaceutical companies, fundraisers for nonprofits, that kind of stuff. I found psychedelic therapy very useful in my own mental health journey. So that is actually one of the things that got me interested in humor in science communication, is that I found that there was actually a lot to be mined in the world of psychedelic therapy. A lot of like relatable jokes. Now, as a psychedelic stand-up comedian, you guys might be wondering what that means. It means I'm actually only funny when you're on psychedelics, so it won't really work with this audience. Okay, I'm going to skip over this question about whether it's a GIF or a GIF because it's too polarized, guys. Speaking of politicization, it's too polarized. Okay, let's see. I find that college students are hesitant to be vulnerable and laugh at humor. Ugh, that is so sad. Any suggestions on warming them up to laughing and feeling safe to do so? That's a really good question, and I'm sorry, Rachel, that you're experiencing that in your classrooms. That is happening. So I think number one is setting up a safe container. And part of that means how you're going to approach the student. Part of that means how you encourage the students to engage with others. But ultimately, it varies classroom by classroom. So I would suggest, one, that principle earlier about making sure that you're never punching down. And then two, making sure that this is a safe environment, however best you can, sometimes by stating that explicitly. But then, you know, frankly, a lot of the safety actually kind of emanates from within you. Like if you're truly feeling afraid, that can translate out. Try to find the safety within yourself such that it will be contagious to your audience. I find that that works personally for me. Oh gosh, okay, these are funny. You guys are, why am I even teaching you? You guys already know what you're doing. Jason Leaf asks, your high school science fair poster was about Milgram, so have you always been into electrocution? Yes, Jason, I have. I guess that is a recurrent theme, but luckily nobody has touched the exposed wiring today, so I think I'm doing pretty good. Let's see. What do you do if your humor fails? Keep trying or back off? Great question. You know what? You tried, and that's really important. If you truly found something funny and you tried to channel the positivity and it didn't work, you're laughing, you know, you're playing. There's this expression in comedy, which is like, I love, it's called playing for the backstage. And it's where, you know, your audience doesn't find it, but doesn't find it funny, but like maybe the other comedians in the green room do. And it's like a really good way of bolstering yourself because you tried something. And comedy is like an experiment. You know, sometimes you get a null result. And the most important thing is that you tried. But then also, to be clear, don't keep trying. If you keep trying despite groans, that is known as a dad joke. Those are usually discouraged. Okay, here we go. How are we doing on time? I think I'll do one more question before we take off. How to combat aggressive humor with positive humor? Let's do that one since that seems like the most on topic. I think the way, once again, to combat aggressive humor is to channel the positivity within yourself. If somebody is going aggressive, number one, it's like a cathartic vent. They're releasing some of their fear, and that is kind of valuable. I don't mean to like totally put down all aggressive humor. It has its place, but it's really important to kind of sometimes give it space, I think, for people if they're feeling that kind of aggressiveness. However, if it starts to veer into bullying, then you kind of got a sort of separate problem. One thing I like to do, I do have stock jokes, actually, if people start to heckle me or like get a little too aggressive. I'll give you one for free, and we'll end with that, which is just if somebody starts to argue with you in an aggressive way, you could just say, you know, I would love to agree with you, but then we'd both be wrong. So, all right, so on that note, I'm going to be hanging out over here. Thank you guys so much for your time. Spread some science comedy.